Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Marlene Chism to the show. Marlene is a recognized authority on leadership and strategic communication, helping high-level leaders in organizations navigate periods of transition and elevate accountability. She's the author of 4 insightful books, including No Drama Leadership and Stop Workplace Drama. And her expertise is trusted by leaders at all levels. Marlene's work has been featured in USA Today and extends far beyond her writing. She's also a LinkedIn learning expert, offering courses on crucial topics like anger management, handling difficult conversations, and managing high conflict individuals as well. With a degree in communications from Drury University, a master's in human resources development from Webster University, and an advanced training in narrative coaching, Marlene is uniquely equipped to help leaders transform conflict into opportunities for growth. Marlene, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Mason. I'm so excited.
Well, I'm super glad you're here, and there's a lot of topics we can talk about, but on the topic of framing conflict as a growth opportunity, you've said that conflict can be seen as a problem that keeps you stuck, or it can be seen as a teacher that helps you grow. Can you share a story about a leader who embraced this perspective and how it transformed their approach to leadership?
Well, it's actually transformed my approach. And I think it does a lot of my clients because I have a certain philosophy that disagreement doesn't ruin relationships, disrespect does. So we can disagree, but what's happening, as you can see on many of the social media platforms, the minute someone disagrees, even if they're respectful, the next person throws a jab. And very often the disagreement starts with name calling or labeling. And so we think it's about the conflict and we think it's about the disagreement, but it's truly about the disrespect. And when we start to change the way we view conflict, and my definition in my latest book, From Conflict to Courage, I said, if you will look at conflict as opposing drives, desires, and demands, and you look at 2 arrows going in opposite directions, I know that we're probably not on video now, but in opposite directions, then it makes you curious, puts you back into your executive function of your brain to say, okay, if this conflict is opposing drives, desires, and demands, maybe they don't know what my drive, desire, and demand is, and I probably don't know what theirs is. So then it makes you really curious to know why someone sees things the way they do versus calling them a name or getting a tribe on your side to make them wrong. It changes the nature of who you are and your relationships. I'm sure I've got specific examples, but I thought it might be more useful just to share the philosophy of how it's changed me and made me not so trigger happy. It's made me more curious, and it's helping me to do that with other leaders.
Many leaders avoid conflict because of the discomfort that it brings. How can leaders shift their mindset to embrace this discomfort as a necessary part of their growth?
Yeah, that's the hardest thing I think about all conflict is that it's really the discomfort that's creating that. It's the emotional message that we're getting. It triggers the primal brain. And so what I talk about is expanding conflict capacity. And it can become a game. And if you look at it as a game, it's a lot more fun versus, oh, I just need to self-regulate. I just need to bite my tongue. No, it's not about biting your tongue because you're suppressing it. What it's about is feeling the feeling of discomfort and noticing where that is in your being, in your body, and breathing through that and saving up some time. Like if you're the type that gets real aggressive, for example, I even talk about aggression being a form of avoidance because real aggressive people, they're on high alert and they attack. That's to avoid feeling that feeling. They're dispersing the energy the moment it comes up. So if you can say, wow, I didn't realize I was avoiding. Yeah, you're avoiding intimacy. You're avoiding being wrong. You're avoiding your egoic needs to be right. So if you can say, I want to expand, and my way to expand is to read something I don't like, to look at something I disagree with, and I don't need to have an answer. I don't need to get my clan together to make you wrong or to cancel you, but I can sit with that and make me curious about why I am reacting to something that you see differently. So I call that the inner game. And that inner game is just about deciding to expand so that when there's conflict, you don't just trigger, you say, tell me more. Or you say, I feel like I'm getting real engaged in a bad way, so I want to take a break. It's about controlling who you are and how you show up versus blaming everyone for your reactions.
One of in just the first 2 questions of our conversation today, I'm detecting the theme here, and it's curiosity on the part of leaderships.
It
On
really is.
leadership. leadership. Yeah, and that seems to be a very good alternative to a knee-jerk reaction, which a lot of folks have.
And within that curiosity, I mean, one chapter or a piece that I talk about in my book is radical listening. And you can't be a radical listener without curiosity. You're going to be a manipulative listener waiting to catch someone. But if you're really radically curious, then you're going to want to understand where they're coming from. Doesn't mean you agree with it, but it means they feel heard, and that changes the relationship. And I've been really thinking a lot about the questions that we ask, not only other people, but ourselves. And I think I made a little video for TikTok today that is like, if you've got a toxic relationship, whether it's a toxic boss, partner, friend, colleague, employee, you'll know by the questions you're asking yourself. And one of those questions will be, why are they doing this to me? Or why are they doing this? And that question creates toxicity because your brain wants closure. And your brain is going to say, oh, because they've had a traumatic, especially if you care about them, they've had a traumatic experience. They had a rough upbringing. They're going through a terrifically difficult situation. And while those things might be true, that very question helps you to justify their treatment of you. So that question is not that helpful because you're not a psychologist. You're not here to psychoanalyze someone. And it may be true that people need support and they are stressed. But the real question is this okay with me? And if it's not okay with me, what is my boundary? And those questions will guide you to your choices and your right decision in handling conflict.
That's wisdom. That's wisdom. Thank you for sharing that. Let's talk a little bit about the role of mismanagement in creating workplace drama. Can you give me an example of a situation where avoidance led to escalating drama in a workplace and how it could have been managed more effectively?
Absolutely. One thing I see a lot, and I started seeing this pattern, and I came up with this theory that I tested out. And the theory was that every big problem that escalates in an organization, so every big problem that escalates, EEOC complaints, litigation, a lot of turnover, a lot of resistance, and a really big conflict can be traced back to a conversation that should have happened but did not. And what I see is the go-to piece in most corporations is, I call it moving the chess pieces. So there's someone that's not doing their job. There's someone that's the one that's complaining, and people don't know how to manage that. That person complaining goes to their supervisor. Their supervisor moves them around or doesn't know how to handle it. That person goes above their head, and the person above them either listens to it and listens to gossip and then tries to fix it, or they say you need to go back to your supervisor, and it's ignored until they finally file an EEOC complaint of, I'm not being heard and I'm being discriminated against. So what happens is then someone at the very top, a vice president, a senior level person, will say, we need to do a reorg. When they see the legal problem starting to happen, it's a reorg, and it's positioned as, we're going to move you to a different department because your job is changing. They might still do the same job, but it's changed in title and it's changed in location. So the mindset is, we're going to nip this in the bud, and it's wink, wink. And I say that's like seeing a field of dandelions and you clip off the bloom and you say, problem over. There's still a root system, and it's just gone to a different department. So that's sort of like three examples of the avoidance or the manipulation or the moving people versus dealing with the difficulty of having the conversation and coming to a resolution.
You've identified avoidance. I know you speak about appeasement and aggression as common mismanagement behaviors as well. Can you share an example of each and how a leader might address them differently?
Yeah, the example I gave just a moment ago is really kind of the avoidance. We avoid the conversation, we shove it up and down the line. Appeasing it's interesting because those leaders who appease do not realize that they're avoiding. They view themselves as, I'm a nice leader. So avoiding, people that avoid, they kind of know they avoid. Even with this moving around, they know deep down, this is just, they justify it, but they also know that it's avoidance. And there are many leaders that will say, I know I avoid it because I don't like conflict. And that means that they have the idea that conflict is the problem, whereas conflict is not really the problem. The mismanagement of conflict is the problem. So from that belief system, they avoid, and they know that they avoid. The appeasers, however, they play middle ground. Like they say, great idea. Glad you brought that to me. I can't share it at this meeting, but at the next quarterly meeting, I will bring this idea up. Well, since it was appeasing, they forgot all about it. And the next time that meeting rolls around, it's not brought up. They didn't think it was a good idea. So instead of having the conversation to educate the workforce to say, I'm really glad that you're engaging. That's what I wanted. And you came to me with this idea. I want to share with you some reasons why this may not be, the timing may not be right. And yet I still want you to keep engaging because it tells me what you know and what you think. And so it's really hard for leaders to do that, because if they say, we want you to get more engaged, and then people do engage, instead of saying, oh, not a good idea, they say, love it. You're doing a great job. I really think you're awesome. And I see the appeasing in the government sector, to where the way that they grade employees is really generally from a 1 to a 5, and a 2.5 is acceptable. A 3 goes beyond, but no one hardly ever gets a 3 or above because they don't have budget for raises. And so the mindset is everybody gets the same thing, which means the poor employees that are not performing are getting the same accolades, recognition, and pay as the ones who are staying over and working and really doing it. So it's not motivational. So that's another way of appeasing and avoiding.
You know what? That's a very interesting observation on your part, with the how to have that conversation with someone instead of just appeasing them, saying, oh yeah, great idea, but to say, you know what, that is a good idea, but it's not the right time. Because that's truthful. A lot of times the same idea could be good or bad based on the timing. Same idea. Bad timing would fail now, but 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, it's the perfect solution.
Yeah.
So you're encouraging the innovation and saying, hey, I value what you're saying. That is an idea we could use. I'll tuck it away when it's time. So please keep sharing, because you're not discouraging their commitment. You're not discouraging their creativity. And I just think that's a very interesting way to handle that. And I wish more people would do that.
Well, there's also, I read something in a book that really, and it was a dry book. I think it was Peter Drucker, but I think it's called The Concept of the Corporation. And it was a required reading. And I kind of got into it after a while. I got the highlighter out and I thought, let me just put this in my own language. You know, he's brilliant, a brilliant leadership guru. He said, when employees come to you with a bad suggestion, it doesn't mean that they're ignorant, or it doesn't mean they're stupid. It doesn't mean they're not valuable. It means they don't understand your business. So the more you hear from people that like is not an idea that works, instead of judging them, it's a message for you to start educating them on how things really work in your business, how the policies, what the constraints are. If they don't know that, they come up with ideas that seem perfectly logical from their point of view, but it means they're not educated on how things work. They haven't had management experience. They're not legal analysts. So when you start training and educating based on what they think is true, that understanding creates better ideas, and you're still getting them engaged in the business and they're taking interest. But the thing that so many leaders do is they shut people down. Oh, I can't make them mad. I can't make them feel like they're stupid. They're not stupid. They don't understand how things work. They haven't had the exposure, the training, the education.
Very good point. How can leaders develop the conflict capacity that you talk about to stay engaged in tough conversations without resorting to avoidance or aggression?
It's really working on that inner game. It's practicing, and it's practicing in small ways to hold their tongue and wait until the right timing. It's about saying, I can't talk about this right now, or I can tell I'm feeling defensive, and I'm so glad you brought it up to me, but I definitely want to stay in the conversation. Let's schedule it for 2:00 tomorrow. Buying the time until you're not caught off guard anymore is really the key, because at first you're caught off guard with your own triggers and with you get exasperated and frustrated. And so the way you do that is instead of like being caught in the hole and looking up and saying, I don't know how I got here, the next time you see the hole, you still fall in. The next time you see the hole, you walk around. So you learn to put things in slow motion by the practice of managing your own self-regulation. And once you start to learn that, you can see conflict coming almost, and it's not even a surprise. You can notice your own physical responses to someone's anger or judgment or miscommunication, and you start using the executive portion of your brain. So it is rewiring, and it just is new habit building, basically.
You've spoken in the past about the importance of challenging the stories that we tell ourselves about others' behavior. Can you expound on those thoughts and maybe offer some insights on how leaders can better identify and dismantle unhelpful narratives in the workplace?
Yes, and a lot of this is about listening, not only to others, but to yourself. When I was doing my course in narrative coaching, there were several pieces that really stood out for me and helped me to evolve. And I know that I can help this with my clients. One idea is that your story is the source of your suffering. And you have to almost rest on that to really think about it, because it doesn't seem like your story is the source of your suffering. It seems like because I don't have enough time, I suffer and I'm bad at time management. And I was just working with someone a few months ago, an executive that was like, this is rough. Like there's certain things in a certain time of year, like for CPAs, it's tax season. That's hard. That's the reality. They have different pressures, but the pressure of it doesn't need to create suffering. If you tell yourself there's not enough hours in the day and I'm so exhausted and it's not fair, this is my industry, then that's creating the suffering. The reality of what you need to do to get your needs met, which might be hire housework done, it might be hire an assistant to go through some things. I don't know what their choices are in that industry, but your story and the way you're organizing your thoughts around time is creating this sense of suffering that you don't have a choice. But, one of my mantras was to say, time always expands to meet my need, because I was always real time conscious and it created a lot of suffering. So I might be at a presentation, and for any professional speaker, when the other speaker goes 20 minutes extra and then they decide to have a round table about what did you have for lunch and what was the most favorite thing you ate, and you're watching your time tick away, if you're not careful, you become resentful and think, they took my time and now I've got to hurry. No, this is right in the flow of how it's supposed to be. If they want to talk about what they had for lunch on the dime that they've paid me, that is fine, because time is going to expand to meet my need. I'm just going to be present. So once you change that, you're not angry anymore with the flow of how things went. This is for the participants. And if the leaders that organized it didn't see that, that's not on you. I'm here to do a certain job. They gave me a certain time frame. And once you make peace with that, you're no longer in suffering. But if you feel like you need to put everything in your presentation that you planned and you're short at 30 minutes, you don't need to take that on. That didn't belong to you. So it's really about managing the way you talk to yourself, the stories you tell yourself, about other people. And, like, I'm building an online program right now it's called the performance coaching model. And one thing I'm teaching in this realm is to speak to the observed behavior, not your judgment of it. So if I say, well, they don't really care at all about their work, that's just my judgment. But if I say what's happening that shouldn't be happening and what's not happening that should be, well, at meetings, they're looking at their phone and texting when we have a no phone policy. Okay, so now I know what's happening that shouldn't be happening and what's not happening that should be. How does that affect our relationship, the work product, the team, the meeting? If I can put something to the business case on how this behavior is affecting our situation and going against policy, I now have something to work with in a conversation. But if I say you don't care, it's obvious that you're disrespectful, and I'm not going to you're creating drama, because it's all about your interpretation of it versus the observed behavior, which there is a belief underneath that, but really you're not a psychoanalyst. So just here's the observed behavior. Here's what is asked of you. I'm willing to hear your side of it, but this is what I need from you. That's how you have those conversations.
Interesting. When you talk starting conversations on the very similar plane, you've mentioned that not knowing how to start a difficult conversation is a major barrier for a lot of managers and leaders. And I was wondering if you could share an example of an opening line or maybe a tip or strategy that's worked particularly well in a challenging situation.
Yeah, in fact, leads right into the product I'm developing, because I talk about having to plan for the conversation first. That's the number one problem, is you think that we're all adults and I'm going to shoot from the hip. And that is exactly why you get distracted, exactly why you didn't create accountability, exactly why the tone wasn't established. You took the bait and you got derailed and you went to the island called That's Not Fair. You went to that island and you played verbal ping pong, and you wonder how you got there. The reason you got there is you didn't have a system to plan for the conversation. Once you learn the system that I'm teaching, you no longer have to rely on shooting from the hip or staying calm. You've planned for what's going to go wrong and where you want to go. And the first phrase, that was your question, what do? You set the right intention, because the one with clarity navigates the ship. And if I say, my intention is to talk about how we can improve teamwork, if that's the direction of the conversation, then anything about, well, what happened 3 years ago that wasn't fair is not part of that conversation. That's a different conversation.
You're building a fence around that's smart.
we're going forward in how can we improve teamwork, and it's not relevant at this point what happened 3 years ago. We are creating, we are moving forward. We're not going backwards, we're not going to the side, we're not getting distracted, we're not justifying. We're saying, what can we do now? What are we creating? How can we be a better team? And that is the direction of the conversation, including how that decision aligns with mission and values. Because if it doesn't align with those, then it's not congruent, it's not aligned. So it's learning how to identify the situation, the outcome, and the obstacle. And from that, in your preparation, designing an intention for the conversation and what you hope to attain by having this conversation. And so if you don't have an ask at the end of it, if it's just for awareness, then you can say, well, my goal, my intention for this is just to create awareness. But if that's the case, then you don't go down this decision-making tree of all the 3 things you need to do, because I said it was about awareness. So you have to be clear about your intention and what is going to happen at the end of
Interesting.
it.
How can leaders no, I'm absorbing what you're saying, and you're right. And that's a step that I could see a lot of people just skipping because they're operating out of just a reaction.
Yeah. So
And to get clarity of thought before you take action is
what
a good
takes
habit to get into.
yeah, it takes preparation, and no one wants to spend that time, but it's the idea of sharpening the saw. And what I've learned over time is that if you diligently practice this, it'll feel so difficult at first. Just like anything does, reading music, playing tennis, playing pickleball, everything you do, learning a dance step, you just cringe because that uncomfortable feeling. So if you can deal with the discomfort and then sleep on it and then try it again, you do this 2 or 3 times in a row, you will never need to do it to that depth again, because your brain will automatically think like that. It'll think through the forms that I'm teaching people to fill out. You won't need to absolutely get a form out every single time and write it down. But in the doing so, the first 2 or 3 times, it's programming the wiring in your brain for how to think about a situation versus the default, which is they're not engaged, they don't care, I probably need to let them go, or I need to move them to a different department. So it takes away the default and creates a new way of processing information so you can have a different conversation.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, because I had a mentor one time that told me, he said, smart people learn from their mistakes.
Hmm.
Geniuses learn from other people's mistakes. And I'm
Yes.
willing to bet that you've seen a whole bunch of other people make those mistakes that our listeners can sidestep and avoid and still get the benefit of that experience without having to suffer themselves. So
And it
thank you for
changes
sharing
your
that.
story too, because when we're in drama, we're in a story about it instead of the facts, instead of where we want to go. We're into what happened last week, into who's right and who's wrong, into everybody else thinks this, yet you don't understand. We're into all that, which is really wasted energy and wasted focus. So what this does is it helps you maintain focus and to really get rid of all that stuff that's making you so exhausted and taking up all your time.
Could you expound on or share a little bit of insight related to your would you be willing approach to overcoming resistance in employees or teams?
Yeah, I've done a lot of work around resistance. And before I started doing leadership work, I was helping individuals and myself. I was learning and teaching processes for recognizing resistance, releasing resistance, getting back in the flow. So in the work that I do, I talk about 3 types of resistance. There's your resistance, like if you're a very aware person, if you're aware, and there's a lot of people that are not aware, they think it's everybody else. But if you're aware, and most of us that study leadership, we are aware. We know when we're in a state of resistance. It's when we're negative, when we're arguing with someone, when we don't like what we're doing. I call it stuck, attached, negative, and distracted. I call it the SAND method: stuck, attached, negative, and distracted. So if you're in a distraction conversation about who's right and who's wrong and what happened last year, you're in resistance, even if the other person started it. So if you're aware at all, you know when you are in resistance as a leader. The second part is really easy when someone else is in resistance. This is unfortunately the part that almost every leader focuses on, and especially leaders that are not very self-aware. It's real easy to see where someone else is in resistance. They complain all the time. They don't like the new policy change. They're resisting AI. They won't do it. They want to work from home. We need people to come back to the office. Resistance, resistance, resistance. That's so easy. The hardest part for all of us as leaders, this is the third layer of resistance, is resisting their resistance. When that happens, it's when I say, well, I would have a conversation with them, but I already know what they're going to say. So when I'm coaching a leader and I'm saying, this sounds like a conversation, are you willing to have this conversation? They say, well, I've already tried. Well, what happened? Well, it didn't go anywhere. They didn't do what I asked them to do. And so I'll say, well, are you willing to have the conversation again? Well, I would, but I've already done it and I already know what they're going to say. So what this is telling me is that the leader is saying they're resistant. I'm not. I can't talk to them though because of their resistance. So what I am saying as a coach is, would you be willing to have the conversation even though you already know what they're going to say? Because until you're willing to do that, you're the one in resistance, not them.
Interesting.
So the willingness, I call that the fulcrum point of change. And so anytime I'm stuck for myself, I try to say, okay, I know that I'm in resistance because I'm stuck. So I want to get to neutral. Am I willing to move forward even though I don't have all the parts and pieces? And then you'll find the excuses, right? But like that's the question. Or am I willing to fail at this even though I want to succeed? Because when you find neutral and you have this full range of willingness, willing to not know, willing to be successful, willing to fail, you can move forward so easy. So when you're in a conversation with someone, are you willing to let them go? Are you willing to be wrong and that they were right? Are you willing to have an argument and mess up? Are you willing for them to say the same old thing they've always said and figure out where you need to go? Because if you're willing, you can have that conversation. What you're avoiding is discomfort. That's the only thing you're really avoiding is discomfort. And with a little bit of planning, you can get over that.
It's interesting you say that because you're talking about the position of leadership, but on a personal level, as it relates to my own journey with self-development and continuous improvement, and I'm willing to be terrible at something until I'm not. I'm willing to try new stuff. I automatically assume, like, you know what? That's okay that if I suck at this, if I suck less next time and I suck less the next time and I suck less the next time, then eventually I might not suck at this. And to have this skill or this ability or this experience or this knowledge is very, very valuable. So I'm willing to pay the price
Yes.
of not being great at something the first time I do it in order to
Yes.
get the things that matter.
Me too.
And so that's one of those things that when I hear you talking about asking others that you're leading or managing, hey, are you willing to do this? You know, in the Army, I was one of the best advice I got from my professor of military science. He said, you know, lead by example, but never ask anything of your team members that you're not willing to do yourself.
That's right.
Because people will listen to what they'll listen to what you say, but they pay more attention to what you do. And if
Yes.
that's
And
not congruent, you know, it's like, why should we listen to the boss? He's a hypocrite. He's not doing anything that, you know, he's just telling us to do that, but he wouldn't do it.
right.
Anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but
Growth in your being has so much more power when you've already had these lessons. Like I know that I speak with such authority because I have done everything I ask people to do, even from a frontline employee at a factory. I did the things I'm teaching now, and I know it works at any level. And one thing I tell my executive leaders that I coach is that personal growth, a lot of executives have not had a lot of personal growth. They've got business growth and leadership growth from they know how to delegate, they know how to, see talent, but they haven't grown internally, and there's their weak spot. So a lot of people come to me when they're ready for that. When they are so ready, they're not happy in their marriage, or they're feeling like they've attained what they want, but they're not satisfied. And either that or their boss has told them you need to like shove off some, rough corners. What I tell them is that there's no judgment on my part. I can tell you from experience that personal growth, you will feel aversion at first when you're not like you've already learned this because you're like, okay, to be bad, I'm going to suck. And like, you're just okay with it because you already know you're going to have that experience. It's never going to feel good. The vision feels great of being a great dancer, being a great pickleball player, or being a great leader, whatever it is. The middle journey of that, though, that gap, you are going to have so much aversion because even after you've grown for 6 months and you look back at how you were leading or how you were writing or how you were making decisions, the natural outcome of growth is aversion. You're like so shocked at how you thought you were so good and you weren't. What that means is that you've grown, not that you weren't good for that area of time and for that level of consciousness. So you have to get past the aversion and acquire a taste for it. Like that only means I'm getting better. When I look back at all my videos that I thought were pretty good, they were not that good from a different standard. And so that's what growth is.
it's funny you say that about videos because I remember when video became thing for me. I got exposed to, and I saw the vision of this probably 12 to 15 years ago, and I started creating video marketing and video stuff. And I remember the first couple times I got in front of camera, I look at those things, and by today's standards, it was god awful, so humiliating, so embarrassing. But, sometimes I was able to look at those videos and the things that I thought, like, if I was making a gesture, like, oh, that's extravagant gesture. No, you could barely tell. Or, oh, I used a lot of inflection. No, I didn't. Or I used a lot of facial expression. No, I didn't. It was monotone. It was straight. It was trying to be professional, and it wasn't. I wasn't comfortable because I hadn't done it enough.
That's all.
Then after watching those videos, the camera doesn't lie. If I threw in a bunch of uh-huhs and you-knows and uhs and that kind of stuff, or if I had a stone face or no gestures, like, you can't hide. It's on camera. And I actually, if you dig around far enough, you probably still find some out there on the internet because it doesn't forget. But if I wasn't willing to suck, then I would not have not gotten better.
Yeah, and we're going to look at this 3 years from now and go, my God, what were we doing?
Probably so.
I think, though, this is true. Like, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. So I still have people reading my first book, Stop Workplace Drama. When I look on it now, which it was published in 2011. So when I look at it now, I'm like, oh, I thought this was so good. But it was in that day, and for where I was, and the case studies and the language that I used, but things evolve and we evolve with it. And then we look back on it and go, I get people from Spain and from other countries that are just now stumbling onto that book and they're like, it changed my life. Well, I'm not going to argue with that. Maybe they're not ready for my latest book. If that's
Right.
changing their life, it's meeting them where they are. And that's how it works.
Beyond conflict management, what structures or practices can leaders implement to reduce workplace drama and create a stable environment?
There's so much. I think being very aligned in who you are so that people feel a sense of trust. If out of your mouth is coming one thing, but you say, I'm all about a safe culture and I'm all about growth, but yet you're really not. And if you're lying to yourself about who you are as a leader and you need to be perfect, your employees are not going to feel that stable. Another thing that I wrote about in No Drama Leadership was change management. And I do some change management in different small ways, but the thing I think leaders need to understand about change, I talk about 4 different quadrants of change. And so if you look at, the double matrix, if you say at the upper axis, if it was a cross, you have wanted change. And if you look at change as wanted and expected, so then you would have quadrant 1 would be wanted but not expected. Quadrant 2, wanted and expected. Quadrant 3, neither wanted nor expected. And quadrant 4, expected but not wanted. If you look at 4 different quadrants of change, there's different challenges with every single one of those quadrants of change. And what I find is that, people say, oh, people resist change. So I challenge that notion. People get married, they get divorced, they stop smoking, they start smoking, they start, playing pickleball in senior years. People move to different countries. So people don't necessarily resist change. What they resist is lack of autonomy, and they resist uncertainty. So if you as a leader can create enough certainty through your communication, so maybe today we don't talk about the 5-year vision. Maybe today we talk about what we need to do to get through this day and what success looks like today. And I create some certainty and I create some success. And maybe if you have a certain choice about what shift you work or what job you do or what your role is, I create some certainty and I manipulate certainty and autonomy. If I can manipulate those 2 things, we can keep things in change fluctuating at a better pace, I think.
So 2 of the things I'm really picking up: trust, because as a leader, your decisions are only as sound as the people. As your decisions are only as sound as the facts in which they're based. And you can't be everywhere. You can't see everything. You can't hear everything. You have to rely on other people in your team to be able to provide you with the real data points to make good choices. And if they don't trust you, they are going to withhold some of the things that may be very, very important to your decision-making process because they don't trust or they don't have certainty in how you'll respond. Or like, I understand that. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm glad that you shared that. I agree with you 100%.
I think too, I've been thinking a lot about trust again because a colleague of mine is doing some research on trust and conflict. I think that trust again, it's at quadrants. And I know Stephen Covey is the master of trust, the speed of trust. I mean, they would be a great person for you to interview because he lived his life with that message that trust speeds things up and the lack of trust slows things down. And I believe that's true. I think there's trust in different ways. Like I could trust someone's capabilities and their competence, and I could just say they are the best. But I may not trust their character. If they are always looking out for themselves and if there's a little bit of a shady deal always going on, they're brilliant. But like I don't feel emotionally or mentally safe in the decisions as it pertains to me. So to me, you can hire for competency, but you either have character or you don't. You either are living in alignment and in honesty and integrity. You can't sabotage that. Like people see that. So if you're not competent, people will forgive that if you've got the right talent to help you manage. But if you have a lack of character, to me, that's where the cow eats the cabbage.
It is.
You know?
It's interesting you say that because I'm thinking it's been a long time. I paid for my way through college with Army ROTC, so I was a military officer right out of college, and I can think back to other lieutenants who were young leaders, and some of the troops that really trusted them, because I had some of the guys that I was lieutenants with gone on to become generals and were excellent human beings and excellent leaders. And I can remember even as young lieutenants how if a colonel or a general came by to spot check maintenance on vehicles out in the field or whatnot, those enlisted men on those teams that respected and admired and trusted their leaders had their backs. And they had the ability, when they were asked questions, they could give the correct answer, or they could give just enough to the point that, well, Lieutenant never told me that. Lieutenant, we haven't seen him. Lieutenant never said that. They could very easily throw and technically not have done anything wrong. They were just being honest and answering questions. But what they chose to answer and what they chose to share, because the trust was there, they had their lieutenants back, and they would say, "This has been covered. This has been covered. This has been covered. This has been covered. We're great, sir." They could say that to a colonel or to a general with full confidence that they've done what they were supposed to do.
Absolutely.
All else being equal, if the lieutenant they worked with or worked for had not earned their trust, they could have very easily said, "But we didn't know this," or "They didn't say that," or, "What do you want us to do, sir? We haven't had any direction on this thing," and caused drama and caused conflict because they would have liked to have seen the lieutenant squirm.
Yep.
And they would have loved to throw the lieutenant in the hot seat if that trust and respect hadn't been there. And I don't think that's any different than what goes on in the workplace at all.
Well, it's not. In fact, I was a factory worker for 21 years before I started doing this. And I think it's really funny how at the top level, a lot of times they don't realize that if an employee wants to sabotage the line and the productivity and make it look like a complete accident and lose money for the company, they can do it. And they do it, because it gives them a break. They get to go home early if they've been overworked. So you can think that you have power and control, but the little people have some power and control too that you don't even see and you would never think happens. So
it's funny you say that, because I'm totally dating myself, but I remember, and I think this is right. So I'm going to throw in this could be wrong, but if my memory serves me correctly, Brian Bosworth, the famous linebacker from the University of Oklahoma, I think he talked one time about having a summer job working for a auto manufacturing place and talked about putting, I don't think he might have talked about putting Coke cans or something in the inside of the vehicles so they would clatter or something like that. It was something along those lines. And why?
If employees don't really identify with their work and their boss and their colleagues, if it's just a job, if you are treated as a cog in a wheel, which you are in many, many types of jobs, you're a cog in a wheel. You're important when we need you, not important when we don't. If you're treated like a cog in a wheel, you will act like a cog in a wheel. That's what you'll do. But if you feel a sense of ownership, if you feel a sense of trust and camaraderie and you feel appreciated, and it sounds so touchy-feely, doesn't it? But it doesn't have to be to that level. You can still have hard conversations. You can still, it really has to do with intention, which we talked about earlier. If you as a leader see the individuals that work with you and for you as people with their own desires for growth. And I know I've heard a lot of people say, well, my folks don't desire growth because they just do their work and then they go home and they have a beer and they pet their dog and they get their paycheck. I don't agree that that's true. I think you haven't tapped into something that's important to them. Because when people start feeling a sense of what I contributed mattered, whether it was an idea, whether it was a skill, then they start getting really engaged, and it's no longer about just drinking a beer and cashing your check and petting your dog. It becomes about something more, and that may be harder to find in certain types of work, and especially at very frontline levels. But I was frontline level, so I already know from my own experience that once I started seeing my interests and my power, and I wanted to be seen, and I was not seen at all. And I'm so happy that I had that experience, because I know from personal experience that is true.
And it's, you're right. If listeners could take, and this is, if you've seen any of my podcasts before, this question's coming. If listeners could take away just one thing, this conversation about conflict and leadership, what would you want it to be?
Conflict is not the problem, mismanagement is. And there's another thought too. Clarity can change any situation. So I repeat that to myself anytime I'm misaligned or stuck or resistant. I realize that in me is a lack of clarity in some area, and that clarity can change any situation. So
Can you expound on that a little bit? Maybe
okay,
give me an example.
clarity can change any situation.
Yes.
Okay, I'll give a personal example, and I use it in my business all the time. People don't understand what clarity is. Let's say there's an argument, there's a conflict that's going on, and then you're like, I'm done, I'm quitting, I'm clear. You're not clear because you're still angry. Clarity feels like I've done my due diligence, I've addressed my anger, I've asked for what I want, I'm not going to get it here, and the boundaries aren't being respected, and unfortunately, I have to make a decision that's right, and it feels like peace. Clarity is actually a feeling, it's an experience of peace. It's not certainty, it's clarity. They're two different things. So the way that I came to this understanding was through writing my first book, Stop Workplace Drama. And as with a lot of people, but we don't talk about this in the professional world, but the same principle applies personally and professionally. It was rolling around to be Thanksgiving. I was going to have the Thanksgiving meal, and the normal family dramas that crop up of, if you invite so and so, my wife isn't coming. They said, this person offended them last year. Then it'd be like, my mother would be like, if they're not invited, that's going to be terrible. It's going to ruin it turned into this, if you don't do something to make me happy, my life is going to be ruined, and you're responsible for my feelings and everyone else's feelings. And I thought, wow, like that book was just my opening to so many things, because I had to live the things I was teaching. So I just did some quiet meditation and journaling, and I started thinking, like, what are my choices? What do I want? And I saw my choices. I could decide not to have a Thanksgiving dinner at all. I could decide to play that game of, let's try to manipulate so that people that want to be there are there. And I could take that all on everybody else's drama and upsets with each other. Or I could say, this is my home, it's my Thanksgiving, and I get to invite everyone that I want to invite. And if you choose not to come, that is not on me. I'm not choosing that for you. You're choosing that, and I hope you come. And if you certainly, if that doesn't align with you, then that's just going to be. And if mother's unhappy, then I can't take that on. She has to work on her ability to deal with her emotions. It's not mine. It's not my monkey, not my circus. And so I just decided, and I just told everybody, I'm inviting everybody. I'm not leaving someone out. It's my house. I can ask people to leave if they misbehave. And so I invite you to come. And I also graciously accept your decline if that's what you have to do. And I felt so crystal clear. I enjoyed that holiday so much. And so now I know that we have to get to the fulcrum point of change. I have to be willing to find my clarity and let the chips fall where they may, and not think that just because I found clarity, there's a magic fairy out there and everybody's going to be happy. They may not be, and I have to be okay with that.
Thank you for sharing that. So if people wanted to connect with you, learn more about you, your books, your business, your speaking engagements, what's the best way for them to do that?
Emailing me, Marlene at marlenechism.com. They could also go to my website at marlenechism.com. I'm on LinkedIn. You can connect with me there and say that you heard me on this podcast. So there's all kinds of ways. I'm pretty responsive. If I don't get back with you, it means I didn't get it. So yeah, connect with me. I just use my name for everything because that's just easier for me, not because it's a big ego thing. It's just that I'm creative and I can call my work 1,000 different things. So it's just marlenechism.com.
Well, Chism, Chism, is much
Yep.
easier to spell than Duchatschek. So
Yeah.
that's an advantage you've got that
Yeah.
it's a little tougher for me.
Yep.
But
And you can get my latest book, which is From Conflict to Courage, How to Stop Avoiding, Start Leading. You can get that on Amazon or anywhere where books are sold.
Marlene, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that the listeners get as many actionable ideas and practical tips from this conversation as I did. I really appreciate your time and hope that we can catch up and do this again sometime soon.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.